Good morning. Good morning. May I have your attention, please? Good morning. My name is Lindsay Anderson. I am the class of 1979, and I am also chairman of the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium. The symposium brings together the academic thought leadership of MIT, together with the Indian Trench's global experience of leading CIOs and industry experts. And for those of you in finance, CIO means Chief Information Officer. So the symposium is, over the last 3 years, we've had average 900 attendees. And what's remarkable about it is the symposium is led by volunteers. So there's volunteering for this MIT is a great opportunity to develop for personal development, networking, and also to enhance the brand of MIT, because the brand is about experience. And the more that you engage with each other and with the external world, the stronger the MIT brand becomes. So I encourage you all to participate in your local MIT and hopefully MIT Sloan alumni opportunities. So it's my great opportunity to introduce Professor Simon Johnson because he's been involved with the symposium. He's been one of our thought leaders over the past 2 years. The first year he spoke about blockchain. And this year he talked about his new book, and more about that momentarily. So the key thing here is, let me tell you more about Professor Simon Johnson. He is the Ronald A. Kurtz 1954 Professor of Entrepreneurship here at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is also where he also leads the Global Economics and Management Group here at the Sloan School. He is the chairman of the MIT Sloan MBA Fellows Committee. In addition to that, he is the founder and co-founder and leader of the the entrepreneurial yes, the entrepreneurial, the Global Entrepreneurial Lab. Yes, GLAB. I'm sorry about that. Yes. And, that's his MIT specific background. Let's talk about a more global background. So he's the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. He has co-founded and is a frequent contributor to the economics blog Baseline Scenarios. Yes, thank you, thank you. He is co-author of the 13 Bankers, Wall Street, the Wall Street Takeover, and the next financial meltdown. So he is here today to talk about his new book, which is Jumpstarting America: How Basic Science Can Revive Economic Growth and the middle class. So without any further ado, let's start Jump America with Professor Simon Johnson.
Thanks very much for those very kind words of introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all this morning. And what a great weekend we have, at least in terms of Boston weather, for your reunion. This is the 30th anniversary of my graduation from MIT. Just wanted to share that. I know. I got a PhD in 1989. I was 10. Get that on the record. And you are exactly the people I want to speak with about this book and the ideas that we're putting forward right now at this point in global and in American history. In the fall of 2017, Amazon announced they wanted to build a second headquarters, HQ2, you all remember this. It would create, they said, roughly 50,000 jobs, and these would be good-paying jobs, at least $100,000, perhaps actually higher in some reports. And they said, announced with a 6-week deadline, that any city in North America could bid. Now, 6 weeks is a pretty tight deadline in this business. 238 communities immediately raised their hand and said, yes, we want these jobs. Come to establish HQ2 in our city. We will give you tax breaks. We will build infrastructure. We will, I think one governor said he would change his name. I don't know if that was appealing or not. There was a frenzy. And there was a moment, you remember this also, I think this was a cultural moment, where an impression was created, maybe by Amazon, maybe by other people, that this would be a so-called transformative investment. That some place that was not particularly on the radar, maybe a little bit left behind, needed a boost, would get this inward investment and would become quite different as a result of what Amazon was going to do. Seattle, as I'm sure most of you know, has been transformed over the decades by tech companies, including first Microsoft and Amazon, absolutely part of that wave. So some other place could participate in this tech boom. In November 2018, of course, Amazon announced their decision, which was to split HQ2 jobs between Washington, D.C., picking a Crystal City, which is just across the river from the mall, right behind National Airport, and Long Island City, which is just across the river from Manhattan, pretty close to LaGuardia, and Kennedy Airport, for that matter. And I think there was pretty much a universal expression of disappointment across the country from those other places who were like, well, really? This is not transformative, at least as we understood the term. Amazon's reaction, which I think is completely legitimate, I'm not here to criticize Amazon at all. They're a company, they make money, they're responsible to their shareholders. They said, we're looking for the talent. We are hiring talent, we want to go where the talent is. Our talented people want to work where talent is already resident. Washington, D.C., New York City, in their view. Of course, in a nice, special, New York twist of the story, they kick Amazon out about 3 days later. We'll talk about that too, and I do think that's actually part of what we need to understand here. Why do I tell you this story about Amazon? Why do we begin the book with this story? Well, I think there are 3 elements that we want to talk about today, and we want to think about together in terms of American policy and politics and business and what we can do individually and collectively differently going forward. Those 3 elements are jobs. How do we create more good jobs? And I'm going to argue, put my punchline right on the table at the get-go, you need growth. You need productivity growth, you need economic growth. That's the primary driver of good jobs in this country and other countries. So how are we going to get this growth? Second question, though, is coming out of the Amazon experience, where exactly could these jobs be created? Where should they be created? How should we think about the geography of economic growth going forward? And I think this is a very hot and sensitive topic in the US right now for a lot of sensible and entirely appropriate reasons. The third question, which is perhaps the thorniest, but you're, again, perfect set of people to discuss it with, is what is our relationship with technology, and you want big tech, if you like, going forward? 3-4 years ago, big tech in my classroom could do no wrong. Nobody was interested in criticism, just interested in getting a job. Now I've got students telling me we should break up Google, Facebook, Amazon, anything that's out there, they want to break it up. I'm like, whoa, slow down a little bit. Let's talk about this. The relationship between technology, what people believe technology and technology companies are going to bring them, that has changed. It's in flux, it's open for discussion, and I think we have some particular ideas about that we're going to articulate in the book, and I think it's a broader discussion. So let me begin by talking about jobs. I'll speak for about 30 minutes, then we've got plenty of time for question and answer. I'm also not running off afterwards. There is another session coming in here which you should attend, or you could talk to me in the hallway afterwards. Your choice. And I'm absolutely open to continuing this conversation electronically, in person, whatever you want to do afterwards. I don't think any policy ever comes unaltered out of a book or a research paper for that matter, and nor should it. I think ideas for policy emerge from conversations, from arguments, from debates, including people like you. And I think that's why I'm here today. And hopefully that's something you will pursue afterwards as well. So let's talk about jobs, and let's talk about growth, and let's talk about American history. And let's talk about what we've been good at in this country in the past, and some of the things we've achieved. Now, there was a discussion at commencement, a fair amount of discussion at commencement yesterday about a couple of anniversaries, one of which, of course, is the D-Day landings in June 1944, which were, the heroism of those people and their achievement is without question, and certainly something that we're full of admiration for, and express that in the book. But if you dial back 4 years earlier, so not the 75th anniversary, but the 79th anniversary of a meeting, June 1940, between Vannevar Bush, who was a former dean of engineering at MIT, he was the head of the Carnegie Institution, research organization in Washington, D.C., and President Roosevelt, June 1940. Level of military preparedness in the United States, honestly, fairly minimal. Very small army, a larger Navy, but it had its technology problems. I mean, the torpedoes the Navy was using at the beginning of World War II did not detonate on contact. And the Air Force, which was beginning to ramp up, also had serious issues around the performance of its aircraft engines at high altitude. So Bush, who's a distinguished, let's call him today I think we'd call him a sort of scientific entrepreneur. He was an academic. He'd set up Raytheon, which was already a significant defense contractor. He knew everyone who there was to know in scientific circles. He wangled his way, and he networked his way into see FDR. And he said, what we really need is a big commitment to science and applying science for the upcoming likely military conflict. Germany, as you recall, in June 1940, had just swept across Western Europe, brushing aside the French army. The British had abandoned all of their equipment at Dunkirk. These were fairly dark and dramatic days. And Roosevelt famously said, and he wrote on Bush's proposal, "Okay, FDR." And out of that came an enormous effort that at its peak, estimates are, employed 2/3 of all physicists in the United States. They developed technologies such as radar, which was, you may know, developed primarily, a big part of it, in the RAD lab, which was up now where the Stater building is now. You can go look at the plaque later if you want to walk. Small plaques commemorating enormous achievement. They invented all kinds of weapons, including better proximity fuse for use in artillery. And ultimately, this exact same effort led to the invention of the atomic bomb. Prior to 1940, and this is a fact that, many of these facts have been forgotten, but this is a fact that few people are aware of. Prior to 1940, the United States was an impressive country in terms of its engineering and things that had been built. It was not the world leader in terms of science. If you look at who won Nobel Prizes in the early part of the 20th century, for example, it was West Europeans, various countries. A couple went to Americans, not very many. This wartime effort and the dramatic contribution of these scientists and engineers to 1944, 1945, and the end of World War II really made clear to people that science and physics, for example, was not a theoretical, abstract proposition. It was something that could reveal very deep properties of the universe that you could then apply, at least to destructive purposes, to wartime purposes. And then they asked the question, the right question, the question we all would have asked if we'd been there, which is, okay, that was a war, the war's over, what can we do for peacetime? Can't we take that same public-private partnership? It was a government commitment to science, it was private and public universities, and it was the private sector that built a lot of this equipment, these devices. Can't we take some version of that to the peacetime economy and create industries that will actually help people live better and generate more economic growth? The report that this group put together was famously called Science, the Endless Frontier. This is a long time before Star Trek, all right? And their point was, and I would also emphasize that the people at the heart of this initiative, including Bush, including the president of Harvard, James Coney, was involved, including the head of Bell Labs, Frank Jewett, who was also involved. He was also head of the MIT Alumni Association, by the way, in 1939, 1940. So this was a small group of people. They were not left-wing people. They were not even Democrats. They had been completely opposed to the New Deal. But they had come, through the crisis of war, to the realization that there was a public-private partnership that could be constructed that would have scientific contributions and applied impact. And their report said, let's save human lives. Item number one is, and they'd made some good progress with with medical treatment, including the deployment and scaling up of penicillin. By the way, footnote here, relevant also to my accent, many of the initial scientific breakthroughs that the Americans used and developed and took to scale, they got from the British. And the British gave them to them because they were absolutely desperate. They had nowhere else to turn, and they had no manufacturing capacity, and they thought they were about to be invaded, and that included penicillin. And included radar, actually, the key piece of radar technology they built the Rad Lab around. So the Americans take it to scale. The Americans have figured out that science can play this role. Let's invent modern pharmaceuticals. Let's invent what became digital electronic computers. Let's invent what became jet engines and jet aircraft and modern civil aviation. If you take all the broad, high-impact innovations that powered economic growth and job creation after World War II, we argue in the book that you can trace back almost every one of those to this wartime effort and to what was done subsequently. And, it's America. We don't never do, we always... When things are desperate, we do great things. When things are relatively easy, we kind of mess around a little bit. So there was a messing around piece in the 40s and 50s. Of course there was. But then the Russians launched Sputnik, 1957. The Americans, of course, were ready. We knew we were in a race to launch artificial satellites. The Russians had got a little bit ahead of us. It was a surprise. But we had a rocket ready to go. The Vanguard rocket, launched 6 weeks later, exploded on the launch pad. All right, so there we had Sputnik from the Russians. The press called it Kaputnik from the Americans. And then the Russians put a couple of dogs up into space who survived. So that became Mutnik. You can imagine the frenzy in Washington. The result was, again, a bipartisan consensus, a big push on science and technology, a scaling up of that enterprise. So another anniversary, of course, being mentioned yesterday at commencement was the first men to walk on the moon. 1969, including being celebrated was the fact that the instrumentation for the Apollo mission was invented on MIT campus, what's now Draper Labs. And not just investing in the science and technology, you'd say creating a demand for skilled labor, technicians, engineers, scientists. The National Defense Education Act of 1958, an almost completely forgotten piece of legislation, which built on, I think, some of what they'd learned from the GI Bill after World War II, and said we need to strengthen physics and math teaching at the college level and at the high school level, and we want to find more talented people and make it easier and cheaper for them to go to college, because that's what the Russians are doing. And it's a war, the Cold War, which I'm not advocating we return to, one dimension of the Cold War was a war or competition for talent, to find the talent, to apply the talent, to give the talent the resources to build better technology, partly for military applications, but a lot of that had big civilian spillovers. So, the next question you should have, quite reasonably, is, all right, Simon, if this is the forgotten history of the middle class becoming so successful and so widespread in America, biggest, strongest middle class in the history of the world, without question, why did we stop? What happened? Why would you back away from something like that? And again, this is America. We don't necessarily sit down and do the cost-benefit analysis always. I think, though, that the history, which is, again, in the book, is pretty clear. 3 things went wrong. The first is, with all due respect, the scientists and the people, particularly in charge of the policy of science, they overreached, they overpromised. They believed a bit too much in the future of nuclear power, for example. So the senior official, responsible scientists in charge of the development of atomic energy really did promise electricity would be free. Well, it's not free, all right? And nuclear power and the building of nuclear power stations has become extremely complicated and extremely costly for some reasons that you all understand all too well. Pesticides. Pesticides were the application of science, taking a lot of that, what they'd learned in World War II, trying to increase agricultural yield. The big push to use pesticide, a big part of it, was not just private industry, it was the Department of Agriculture. Rachel Carson, if you haven't read Silver Spring, if you're only going to read one book about technology and history and its impact on American society, read my book. But if you're going to read 2 books, read Rachel Carson's Silver Spring, or go back and look at her first articles in the New Yorker and how she framed it, and why, and understand why that was compelling and why she had, frankly, a very good point, which I understand remains controversial, but it's a very good point that the costs of technology and the dangers of technology had not been fully taken on board or communicated and shared. So there's an overreach issue. Second problem is the scientists fell out with the policymakers and the politicians. When you want to build a bigger rocket and you want to get your rocket to the moon, there's sort of a confluence of interest there. It wasn't that hard to get an agreement. By the late 1960s, and of course the Vietnam War was an important part of technologies becoming much more concerned about how technology was being used by people in power. But by the end of the 1960s, we had such issues as the development of civilian supersonic aircraft that would fly over the United States. This is very loud, or at least the 1960s version. They tested it in Oklahoma City. Nobody slept all year. The politicians said, let's do it, it's great. They had some private industry backing. The scientists were like, no, this is a bad idea. It's way too loud. So, the fact of the matter is, if you speak truth to authority, authority will cut your funding. Remember that. There was also a massive fight about missile defense systems, and this was a bipartisan fight. LBJ fell out with the politicians. Richard Nixon fell out with the politicians. Nixon did it with a bit more style. He kicked them out of the White House. That's Richard Nixon's thing. But it was a bipartisan parting of the ways. The third problem is, of course, budgets. So even though we have a pretty elastic credit in the United States, and even though we continue to push that pretty far, it is still the case that the turning against taxation from the late 1960s and the development of the Great Society programs, the entitlement programs or the social insurance programs, this has put a squeeze on the domestic discretionary part of the budget. So we used to spend 2% of US GDP on public support for R&D in the mid-1960s. Now we spend 0.7% of GDP. And the core of our book is the argument that we should push that back up. We should go from 0.7% of GDP up, not back to the 1960s, perhaps, but we'd say at least back to where we were in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. So about 0.5% of GDP, additional spending a year, that's about $100 billion of additional public commitment to science is our proposal. And we lay out how that will create jobs and the ways in which that will contribute to productivity growth. It's not a panacea, it doesn't solve all your problems. The social rate of return on R&D is extremely high, and that's what we're pointing out, and there's a lot of literature, a lot of research, some of which is done by our colleagues at MIT, supporting this proposition. But if we're going to do this, actually I think we will do this. I think we will do this because we're a practical people at heart, and we do like these kinds of practical solutions, particularly ones that are rooted in American experience. But I think we also have to think about where we do this. So if you take your R&D dollars and have a big push from the public sector on expanding this scientific enterprise, you could put all the money into MIT in Kendall Square. In fact, I was sitting next to somebody, Michael Bloomberg announced a $500 million commitment to fight against climate change yesterday at commencement. I was quite impressed by many things Mr. Bloomberg said. The faculty member who sat next to me said, well, that's disappointing. There was no money for MIT. I mean, we would like to encourage you to support MIT, don't get me wrong, but the things that are already happening on this campus, Kendall Square, depending on when you graduated, will either look pretty impressive or like a space sport or something, right? I was there in the 1980s. There was nothing there. It was actually so bad in Kendall Square in the 1980s, my contention is, it was actually safe to walk around Kendall Square because nobody had any money, you were not at risk of getting robbed. Central Square was much more dangerous. So you could put the money in here. This real estate, some of this real estate is as expensive as Midtown Manhattan. You could put your money into Midtown Manhattan. If you want to really go crazy, you could go to Silicon Valley. We have 6 major big innovation hubs right now in the United States. On the East Coast, we have Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. On the West Coast, we have Seattle, San Francisco Bay Area, and Los Angeles. These places are all expensive. They're all crowded. The rest of the country, which was hoping to get that Amazon HQ2 investment, is looking at this and saying, hey, we're available. And in our book, we go through, we say, okay, what would you want in a hub? What would you want to develop a tech hub in terms of, you want to have enough population, you want to have a reasonable house price. Our cutoff is like $265,000 for a house, which, as John Gruber, my co-author, likes to say is monthly rent in Boston right now. So you want enough population, you want a reasonable real estate price, and you want a good quality of life, and you want enough educated people. So we have these criteria. We put this on an interactive website. It's called jumpstartingamerica.com. Jumpstarting is hyphenated, like the title in the book. If you like our general idea but don't like our particular index, go to the website and make your own index. Come on, you're MIT graduates. It'll take you like a minute, right? I did a class on this, and one of the students, we were showing people how to use the website, said, yes, Simon, I did that last night. I've downloaded all the data in Excel. Here's what you're missing. It's MIT. So we find, based on our criteria, which we think are pretty reasonable, very transparent, and you can challenge them and adjust them as you wish, we find 102 cities across the United States, 36 states, 80 million Americans live in these places. They could all participate and become dynamic technology innovation hub, if that's the decision. And boy, do they want it. And are they willing to commit and put in local resources? Absolutely. That's the lesson from the Amazon experience. But when I talk to graduating classes from MIT or other universities that should remain unnamed, where do you want to go work? MBAs, we also have this experience with undergraduates. Between 95 and 100% of those people in the room say those 6 innovation clusters, East Coast, West Coast. One woman raised her hand and said, I'm going to Ohio. I happen to know she's going there because she's Chinese. Her Chinese employer would get her a visa if she goes to Ohio. Well, I'm good. Are they going to do great things in Ohio? I'm very supportive, but just think about that. So the talent wants to go where the talent is. What happens when I talk to the private sector? Well, I've had this kind of conversation, as you can imagine, with lots of people who are investors, entrepreneurs. And you do meet people who say, look, I've got this company in Tampa, I've got this company in Maine, I found this technology in Sacramento, and we're going to move them to New York or San Francisco. Why? We want to go where the talent is. The talent wants to go where the talent is. That's what's, agglomeration. And John Gruber's not here today, so he gave me his jokes. John Gruber likes to say that one way economists get paid more is by inventing long, complicated words for things that are completely obvious to everyone else. So agglomeration, the fact that everybody wants to live together and work together. Economists write a lot about agglomeration. This is hyper-agglomeration. We're getting super crowded on top of each other. I know people who are moving activities from Route 128 to Kendall Square to be closer to the action. Well, Route 128 used to be considered part of Boston and part of the Boston cluster. So the talent wants to be with the talent. The private sector, now, we may be wrong. If we are wrong, and if you have opposite experiences, tell me. That we'd love to feature that in our talks. But what we hear and what we see is this is not a self-correcting. Okay, if I was a system dynamics professor, I'd have a graph. I'd have a picture for you here. Anyway, it's not self-correcting. Sorry, that was a system dynamics joke. They're all in the climate change section, right. Downstairs. Other building. All right. So next time you see them, tell them it's not self-correcting. The private sector is not fixing this by itself because talent wants to go where the talent is. Talked to one investor who said, if I bring the CEO and CFO from San Francisco to Sacramento, it's about a 2-hour drive, and the company fails, they have to move back and move their families back to San Francisco. Whereas if I hire them for a company in San Francisco and the company fails, they don't have to change where they park their car. Right? So this is an issue, and we recommend that in scaling up this scientific enterprise and putting more money into research and development, that you should aim to spread this around the country. And here's an idea: run a competition, like Amazon's HQ2 competition, but run that competition not trying to get tax breaks. State and local governments spend $50 billion, $50 billion every year on tax breaks for companies to attract investment to their communities. The facts of the matter, and I'm sorry if you're hearing this for the first time from me, but the facts of the matter are almost all of that investment would have taken place anyway in the place where it ends up. So that $50 billion gets you nothing, almost nothing, in terms of different outcomes, except it's a transfer from local taxpayers to the stockholders of that company. That is not helpful in terms of building your local infrastructure, building your local services, education. Everyone says to me, Simon, yes, this is all very good, well and good, but where's the education piece? Well, look, you need some tax revenue if you want to support public education, certainly. If you're giving away your taxes through whatever mechanism, it makes it much harder. So our competition would not be a race to the bottom tax break competition. Our competition is the positive side of the what Amazon demonstrated, which is there's lots of communities that can come together, universities, private sector, local government. They can provide real estate. They can make sure the infrastructure is there. They can talk about education and figure out how to make the education piece work. I talked to some people who were fairly close or followed closely the thinking in Virginia. So the DC investment by Amazon is, just to make sure everyone understands, is actually in Northern Virginia. So it's just across the line from the river. The line is the river. In Virginia, they, as part of this bidding process, they articulated and are implementing a vision to bring a Virginia Tech, a campus of Virginia Tech, to the DC suburbs. Very smart idea in our view, totally fitting what we're talking about here. At some point in the process, apparently, before they knew they'd won, the people involved said, oh, wait a minute, this is a good idea. We should do this whether or not Amazon comes, right? So Amazon served a catalytic purpose there. It brought people together, and it's about making investments. It's about win-win. It's not taking Virginia Tech away from Blacksburg. It's creating a new part of Virginia Tech close to Washington, D.C., and changing the availability of skills, the kind of education you can get, the access to that for local residents. So we propose to run a competition, and we're proposing to do this in a relatively, look, everything, you talk about government spending, everything gets politicized. You talk about government spending, all the politicians want to get involved. These issues are difficult, there's no question. And we specifically propose to run this through an independent commission. Congress gives you the money. Congress has to sign off on how you spend, but you present it to Congress on an up or down basis, like base closings have been done. Closing bases is extremely hard, very politicized. People fight really hard to keep their bases open, and yet we've been through many rounds of base closings. Not pretty. Nobody comes away happy from that process, but hey, it works. We want to do something along parallel lines, but not for closing bases, but for opening hubs. So we want to scale up research and development. We want to put a lot more science into the mix. And we want to spread it around. Now one completely legitimate question is, hold on, Simon. This R&D you did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that was a particular set technology. There were some generational issues there. And while it's true that public commitment to R&D has declined since the mid-1960s, the total research and development percent of the US economy has remained actually remarkably stable, 2.3, 2.5% of GDP. So what's the problem? The private sector has stepped up in this view to fill the gap left by the public sector. Now, again, I want to be very clear. We are entirely in favor of private sector efforts in this space. We see what we're proposing as complementary to private sector efforts and helping them and facilitating and scaling them up. But we do point out, and we have a chapter in the book that goes through very carefully what we know and the research, and we've talked to lots of people in the investor community about this also. Private sector doesn't do what the public sector does. Take the Human Genome Project, for example. Human Genome Project was the idea of a couple of scientists, award-winning scientists, top people, with entrepreneurial experience, tried to raise $10 million for it in the 1980s, couldn't get it started. Because private investors said, quite legitimately, what you're proposing is to create general knowledge that will be shared across lots and lots of people. We don't see how we would be able to appropriate the gains from that. And you know what? They were right. And it wasn't their job. And it became a public initiative. We spent $3 billion over 13 years mapping the human genome. That industry employs, latest estimates, 270,000 people, average wage of $70,000. It pays in taxes about $6 billion a year on a $3 billion investment. That's a pretty good rate of return. Now that's at the high end of what you can expect, but the definitive work that we have, and there's lots of people who worked on this, but John Van Renen in the economics department below us and in Sloan has the most cited papers on this. The rates of return social rates of return, not private rates of return on R&D are pretty high, okay, and we should do more of it. Social rates of return on research and development are on the order of 50% a year. Return on investment, 50% a year. It's just mind-boggling, right? Every year you're not pushing hard to make these investments and to make them effective. You're leaving money on the table, frankly, as a society. So, more R&D, public R&D, complementary to the private piece. Commercialization, of course, commercialization is very important. We've worked long and hard on this at MIT. I'm sure we need to do a lot more work. I'm sure all of you can help us make commercialization more effective, spread the benefits and the gains from science. That's absolutely what we want to be, and a lot of what I do at MIT these days is about that. Public R&D, commercialization, private sector development, good job creation comes out of that. Make those opportunities available to a broader set of people around the country. How many new hubs should you try to create? Well, not 50. If it's 50, then every state gets one, and you know what that's about. No. Not one, because we want to move the needle. You want different, if you want a different set of macroeconomic outcomes, you need to make a different macroeconomic scale commitment. Between 20 and 30 new hubs should be the agenda. Enough to move the needle, enough for there to be plenty of scope for participation by various states in different kinds of geographies, and enough so that some things will go well, because you know what the biggest problem is with what we're proposing? Oh, well, I mean, okay, MIT graduates, I'm sure, can find about 5 problems in the next, when I stop speaking in a moment, but the biggest problem we see so far is this. If you gave your money to a private venture capitalist, and the venture capitalist said, good news, I made 10 investments, 9 of them were a success, 1 was a failure. I think your reaction would be, what? You didn't take enough risk. How could you get 9 successes? You know, venture capital is really happy if they get 3 home runs out of 10. 1 home run out of 10 will often pay for everything. In the United States, if the government makes 20 investments, 19 are successful and 1's a failure, that's the scandal. Robert Mueller will be pulled out of retirement. We'll have another big thing, right? We cannot deal with failure in the public sector. That's something that has to be confronted directly and discussed, and that's part of the reason to write the book. Had that discussion. But here's the third piece. I'll say this briefly, and then we can do question and answer. And this is related to the relationship between big technology and technology development and entrepreneurship and people. I think, the American citizens, I think that people who graduate from MIT tend to be pretty comfortable with technology and tend to do very well from technology, I would say. A lot of other people around the country are less convinced that technology is that helpful for them. They've seen jobs disappear through automation. They've seen the premium to skilled labor go up, but a lot of middle-class jobs come under increasing pressure. David Autor, who's down in the economics department, I think will one day win a Nobel Prize for his work that makes this extremely clear to everyone. So if we're going to make this public investment, if we're going to create new hubs, and we're going to recognize and use and build on the hyper-agglomeration phenomenon, talent comes where talent is, then what we're basically doing is creating local real estate booms. Right? The price of real estate in these hubs is going to go up. Amazon knows this. They secured their real estate deals and locked it all up before announcing where HQ2 was going to go. Of course they did. Otherwise they're going to be paid. The prices in condos in New York went up 20% when they announced the New York deal. Then I presume they came down 20%. But there are various ways to participate in the upside. This is not about taxing existing wealth. This is creating wealth and ensuring there's direct public participation in the value that's created. There are various proposals out there. We can talk about them. The one we like is recognizing what's going to happen to real estate, thinking about experience, for example, around the corner here, and saying that some of that real estate, as you put together the package or the land bank, as you make that land available for development, particularly in the inner commercial hub, some of that should be either held by government or there should be a deal so that appreciation in the value of that land comes back to, actually not to support general government programs. We would rather put that into an endowment fund with the goal of paying out cash to all Americans. Alaska does this with oil revenues. So the Alaska Permanent Fund pays out between $1,000 and $2,000 a year on average. May not sound like a lot of money to some of you. In Alaska, it lifts 20,000 people out of poverty every year. So create a cash dividend, an innovation dividend is what we call it, based on the appreciation in the real estate that with certainty is going to happen when you make these commitments to create new hubs. Share that wealth with more people. Is it symbolic? Yes. Is it more than symbolic? Well, we'll see how we do, right? How much money comes from this. It is changing, very much about changing the perception of science and technology. And it's very much, it's also related to the geographic idea. Science spending has become too much tied up with this elite, anti-elite issue in the United States. Because, oh yeah, of course you want more science funding. You work at MIT. You live in Boston. You're from Silicon Valley. Well, it's a fair criticism, frankly. And I think that we should look at ways to not take resources from those places, but to build up other places as strong scientific hubs. This is not about charity. This is not about handouts. This is about underutilized strategic potential of the United States. There are talented people everywhere. There are people who want to work hard, people who are good at innovation. There are places that are good at innovation. We happen to put Rochester at the top of our index. As soon as the book came out, they invited us up there. John gave a talk at a conference or an event they called Jumpstarting Rochester. Rochester has a long history of optics. They're developing photonics. There's a lot of tech potential there. There are, in our view, 100 places around the United States where you can make that happen. But if you don't think about the politics, you don't think about how to generate support, and if you don't think about how to really broaden participation, then either this won't happen, or it'll happen for a while, then there'll be a backlash, and you'll lose it again. So, scale up the scientific enterprise, share it more broadly with all Americans, and create an innovation dividend that puts more cash in people's pockets, everybody's pockets, if this is more successful. Thank you very much. All right, we have questions. Microphones coming around. I see, thankfully, we're not using the MIT throwable microphone today. I was worried about the legal issues of that one. Yes, Ralph.
Thanks, Simon. One observation. You mentioned the moon landing 50 years ago. On the flight here, I watched this movie, Apollo 11. And if you think 50 years before the moon landing was basically flying was just invented. So in the time from horse-drawn carriages to being on the moon, and nothing has happened since. So I think your theory, the big event obviously was World War II. And you mentioned also the Nobel Prize winners. I think there's it's not about where they're from, but a lot of them were Jewish. And what World War II obviously did, or the Nazis, was they put all the Jewish brilliant minds who was dispersed in Europe into one place where they could work together. And I think that's a challenge of your observation, of your theory, is how do you create this artificial pressure that World War II created without having a big external event like this? I mean, you can ask for money and policy change, but if you don't have this event, how do you do that? For me,
right.
that's
a very good point, and we do hear this from other people as well, which is World War II was, first of all, immigrants to the United States, including refugees, played a really important role in the development of the American scientific enterprise, and we should recognize that, and we talk about that in the book. Secondly, you're quite right, that events, World War II, Sputnik, absolutely fits this, and of course, setting the goal and achieving the goal of getting to the moon. The problem with getting to the moon was, once you got to the moon, where were you going next, right? So I don't think a mission with this outcome that when you're done is exactly the right way to do it. But you're quite right that pressure or feeling competition is part of the political process. Well, look around the world. I mean, this book is not about bashing China or anyone. We think this is a win-win approach for lots of countries. We're 329 million people in the United States, in a world of 7 billion. There's a lot of problems to be solved. There's a lot of other countries working on technology to solve those problems. If you invent technology first, if you invent the science and if you apply it first, so the British invented a lot of science early, didn't apply all of it, the Americans applied a lot of it and then got busy with the invention. If you get that piece right, you get more of the good jobs for a long time afterwards. Biotech would be absolutely perfect example, right? So I think that the competition is for good jobs. And it's for more good jobs, and it's for a higher share of good jobs around the world. And would it take some precipitating event, some some headline. I don't know. Maybe. I certainly don't want. I don't want confrontation, and I don't think war is helpful in this context. But you're right that the politicians have to see it through a lens of pressure for something to happen.
And sorry.
Okay, let's get a few more voices in.
Hi, Simon. Great to hear. Sorry from you again. So one of the issues I see looking at the States is that people trust government less and less and less and less. And to be able to do this, you need to trust that the government can deliver and trust the money, or the tax money to the government to do this. And I see the opposite happening in this moment. How do you look at that?
So I think that's a very fair point if we're talking about the federal level of government. There's a lot of questions about trust coming from both sides of the political aisle. If you go talk to people at the state and local level, or if you're involved in the corporate location business, is what we hear from people who are thinking about where to locate their companies, there is very little difference between Democrats and Republicans at the state level, for example. They all want more good jobs. They're all putting government resources into the mix, maybe too much, right? This is our, the race to the bottom kind of point. They are all attempting to play a constructive role in coalitions that involve the private sector. I think universities often play a constructive role and we want all technical universities, all universities that are all relevant to this proposals to be engaged and to think about this. So I think it's local and state government working with a coalition with a strong private sector voice. Look, many of you, probably most of you, work in the private sector. I think you can absolutely play a role in this kind of thinking in your own communities. And I think that's how you get better outcomes out of government. So the role we have for the federal government, I understand, may sound expansive, but primarily we want to run it through an open, fair, transparent competition, and then measure the results and be able to evaluate it and see what works, and then learn from that and do more of it. That's a fairly limited government focus. And I don't want to fund more government programs out of the success. I want to put cash in people's pockets. That Alaska idea came from a libertarian, was adopted by the mainstream Republicans in Alaska. Republicans have run Alaska for a long time. It's not a controversial idea. Who's got the microphone?
Thanks for the talk. Question on, so the tech industry in general, I mean, obviously it fuels innovation, but increasingly there are winner-take-all markets. So there is this huge inequality that comes from having just the dynamic of tech industry. So one of the concerns would be if you start, exporting this to 30 innovation hubs, you actually start exporting Silicon Valley's promise, huge income inequality, as well as transportation, like underinvestment in common resources. Is the dividend really enough to overcome those things, or do you need to think about that more deeply?
All right, so I think that's a very fair question. Would we just be spreading some of the problems? Of course, there are parts of the country who would like some of those problems. That's one thing. Secondly, I think we can and should learn from the lessons of Silicon Valley and also Seattle. We know what happens when this is successful, and we know affordable housing becomes a big issue, for example. So that while we do think there would be a commercial hub which would also have mixed-use real estate, and that's where you get a lot of the capital appreciation, we would also recommend making a criteria in the innovation bidding process that local and state government make available space and zoning that would facilitate affordable housing within a reasonable distance of where you're going to have these R&D activities. By the way, one counter to what we propose is some people have said, look, why go to all this effort? Why not just change the zoning in Boston or Silicon Valley so more people can live there? Well, that sounds to me like a completely impossible political task. I'm not interested in wasting my time on that. Imagine getting permission to put up 5 new big buildings right there. You're not going to happen. Silicon Valley, I mean, the news reports are you can't even get permission to build a 5-story building next to a metro stop, next to a mass transit stop. So that's hard, right? But I think we should take those lessons and think about how to have a better urban planning approach, anticipating that this will be successful, that it will get scaled up and people will want to live there. And I think we can not remove, I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think income inequality in the United States disappears because of this. But I think you're going to address some very pressing problems and a lot of anxiety, and you can share prosperity better.
Thank you for the talk. Two questions. One is, do you have a view as to the size a hub needs to be before it could become self-sustaining? And then the second one, which may or may not be related, is if we go from 6 hubs to 26 or 36, do you see additional challenges or complexity with having those many hubs in terms of dispersion of talent and in terms of the ability to collaborate in that context?
So, what's the right critical mass for a hub? It's a good question. We don't know yet. I mean, I think that, city, when we use this criteria with 100,000 working population, seems to us to be a plausible place to start. Some people think it should be larger, say with 1 million, but we have a lot of cities that have at least 1 million working age population in the United States. Would we be sort of diluting our effort if we dispersed across different cities? Well, I think it depends how you do it. If the hubs are concentrated in a particular technology or a particular vertical, I think you're not actually losing much, and you are gaining broader political support. And you may actually, the way the Industrial Revolution developed, at least in this country and also where I was born in the UK, was actually multiple hubs, multiple places. It's not clear that you need to have this hyper-agglomeration just in a very few places. That is not apparent to us. And given also how expensive and crowded the existing hubs are, the most creative idea I've heard of from people in San Francisco is, hey, we're going to move to LA. Well, really? I mean, how far does that get you? At some point, I think the pressure on the private sector piece becomes overwhelming. You've got to get some other geographies into the mix. So let's get ahead of that. Who's got where's the microphone?
Over here, I have one.
Okay.
So thank you. I agree with the concept. I had the pleasure of working in the Bloomberg administration when we came up with the applied sciences competition, which attracted Cornell Technion. And so really, that has been a real catalyst, the same kind of spirit. And there are a lot, that's one of the few things where you can do not choose a winner, but bring in talent. I guess my question is, how do you avoid these things invariably become political? Everyone wants to have one. So how do you have selection criteria that doesn't allow this to be frittered away? Because you want it to be in places where there's enough critical talent. You pointed at Rochester. But if you open this to the political process, then it's really dispersion of riches. And so there's a lot of other factors which would determine where these were placed.
Right. So two answers to that very good question. How do we avoid becoming too politicized? So one answer is that we had this independent commission, and Congress votes on an up or down basis on the recommendations of the commission, and it's all very transparent and so on. As with base closings, both John Gruber and I have spent a lot of time working on policy and are very aware of how sausages are made in Washington. And frankly, it would not surprise me if through various mechanisms, powerful, influential people in Washington were able to, guide decisions in a certain direction. But let's think about that for a minute. So that, just not to pick on anyone in particular, but it happens that the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee is Senator Richard Shelby from Alabama. Alabama has 6 cities on our list of 102, including Huntsville, Alabama, which was where the Saturn V rocket, which took us to the moon, was developed. So there are very strong, let's say, pockets of technology in a state like Alabama. I don't think Alabama feels connected to the overall national scientific enterprise in the way that Massachusetts does, for example. If that changes as a result of the political process, I think that's a big win. And I have not heard any member of Congress of any political indication saying, I want less science or fewer science-related jobs in my state or constituency. In fact, I would suggest, if you happen to be thinking about running for office, I mean, John and I are barnstorming across the country, selling our ideas to everyone, and we're not running for the presidency. I mean, how unusual is that these days? But if you're interested in running for political office at any level, I would propose to you more good jobs is hard to say no to, right? And I want more people from different political persuasions to get on board with that and to see science as a mechanism through which they can get more good jobs for their communities. Okay, maybe one last question? Yeah, one last question. How about, here's the microphone back there. We can talk in the hallway afterwards.
I was wondering what your view is of the opportunity zone legislation around tax benefits. It seemed like there targeted towards some of these areas?
Yeah, so the opportunity zone legislation, which came out of the recent tax cuts, is really interesting because, on the one hand, there is, without question, an admirable effort to try and revitalize some areas, including urban areas, and it could be complementary to what we're talking about, right? Because there was an implicit revitalization part to the Amazon story, to our story. The opportunity zones are, they're a tax expenditure, so you get to defer and perhaps never pay capital gains on existing capital gains that you had and the appreciation in the opportunity zone. It's pretty expensive in terms of a tax expenditure, so there's a value, we're putting in public resources, either government spending or tax breaks, right? It's the same thing, different sides of the ledger. And so you do want to think about how much return you get for that public commitment. So the opportunity zones are pretty expensive. And another concern is that they might become, in terms of the flow of capital, overly focused on places that are going to do well anyway. So I've looked at some prospectuses that are trying to sell me to invest in some parts of Oakland, where the story is this is just the San Francisco Bay Area, this bit hasn't appreciated yet, come and invest with us, get a 30% gain, you're not going to pay a lot of tax. I'm not opposed to that, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. So we are thinking quite hard about ways we might engage with that opportunity zone community and also think about different ways or tweaked ways in which it could be lined up more with what we're talking about. I mean, I honestly think that everyone in the country wants and needs more good jobs. I don't think that's a difficult conversation. How to get there, what's the mechanism, and we know we want the private sector to be involved, obviously. That's the big job creation machinery. And the public sector has in the past, and I think continues to be, when it's done right, complementary to private sector job creation. So we're arguing about the details. They're kind of important details, and how much should be expenditure side, how much should be tax breaks for whom, when, and how. It's a very legitimate conversation, but we're all pushing in the same direction. So we just want to push harder, faster, and do more. Okay, so time is up. Thank you so much. Happy to take more questions outside. Thank you.